Imagine the ancient city of Alexandria at sunset. The sea is calm, and the sky slowly turns gold and deep purple. Ships from distant lands rest in the harbor after long journeys across the Mediterranean. Merchants speak many languages in the crowded streets. Scholars walk through marble halls discussing philosophy, science, and politics. At the center of this brilliant city stands a royal palace beside the shining waters of the Nile. Inside this palace lives a young woman whose name will echo through history. Her name is Cleopatra. For more than 2,000 years, people have told stories about her. Some describe her as the most beautiful woman who ever lived. Others describe her as a mysterious seductress who controlled the most powerful men of Rome. Paintings, poems, plays, and films have turned her into a symbol of romance, power, and danger. But the real Cleopatra was far more complex than the legend. She was not simply a beautiful queen sitting on a golden throne. She was a ruler who lived during one of the most unstable and dangerous periods in the ancient world. Kingdoms were rising and falling, empires were expanding, and the growing power of Rome threatened the independence of many nations. Egypt was one of the richest lands in the world. Its fertile river valley produced enormous wealth. Its cities were centers of trade, culture, and knowledge. But wealth also attracts powerful enemies. Cleopatra understood this reality better than most rulers of her time. She knew that survival required intelligence, courage, and careful political strategy. She studied languages, diplomacy, and philosophy. She observed how power worked among kings, generals, and empires. When the moment arrived, she would use everything she had learned. Her life would bring her face to face with two of the most powerful men in Roman history, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Together, they would shape the destiny of Egypt and the future of the Roman world. But Cleopatra's story is not only about politics and empire. It is also a story about ambition, survival, loyalty, betrayal, and the difficult choices leaders must make when the fate of their nation is at risk. To understand Cleopatra, we must go beyond the myths. We must return to the beginning. Before the alliances with Roman generals, before the wars that would decide the future of Egypt, we must return to the moment when a young princess was born into a royal family where power was dangerous and the throne was never truly safe. Because long before Cleopatra became a legend, she was simply a child growing up inside a palace filled with ambition, rivalry, and hidden threats. And that is where our story truly begins. Chapter 1. A Princess Born into Power. The story of Cleopatra does not begin with a throne. It begins with uncertainty. It begins with a palace where power was both a privilege and a danger. In the ancient city of Alexandria, a child was born into one of the most powerful royal families in the Mediterranean world. This child would later become Cleopatra the Seventh. But at the moment of her birth, she was simply a princess surrounded by wealth, tradition, and silent political tension. Alexandria itself was a city unlike any other. It stood proudly on the coast of Egypt, where the Mediterranean Sea met the lands of Africa and the Middle East. Ships from Greece, Rome, Arabia, and India arrived at its harbors. The city was alive with languages, ideas, and cultures. At night, the famous lighthouse of Alexandria guided sailors safely to shore. Its powerful light could be seen from far across the sea. For many travelers, the lighthouse symbolized knowledge and progress. Not far from the harbor stood the legendary Library of Alexandria. Scholars from many lands came there to read, write, and debate the greatest ideas of their time. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were studied within its walls. Cleopatra grew up in the shadow of this intellectual world. From an early age, she was surrounded by teachers and advisors who understood the value of knowledge. The Greek philosopher Aristotle once said, "The roots of education are bitter, but the fruit is sweet." Cleopatra seemed to understand this truth very early in her life. While many royal children spent their days only enjoying luxury, Cleopatra showed a deep curiosity about the world around her. She studied languages, history, and philosophy. She listened carefully to political discussions in the royal court. One of the most unusual things about Cleopatra was her ability to speak many languages. Ancient writers believed she could communicate with people from many different regions without using translators. This skill made her very different from earlier rulers of her dynasty. But education alone could not protect her from the dangers of royal life. Cleopatra belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family that had ruled Egypt for many generations. This dynasty began after the death of Alexander the Great. One of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy, took control of Egypt and created a new royal line. Although these rulers governed Egypt, they were originally Greek. For centuries, they maintained Greek traditions while ruling over an Egyptian population. Inside the royal palace, family loyalty was often weaker than ambition. The struggle for the throne could turn relatives into rivals. Brothers fought against sisters. Advisors formed secret alliances. Plots and betrayals were common in the corridors of power. The Roman writer Seneca once observed something about power that fits this moment in history. He said, "No man ever became wise by chance." Cleopatra would soon learn this lesson in the hardest possible way. Her father was known as Ptolemy the 12th. His rule over Egypt was unstable and often criticized. Many people believed he depended too heavily on the support of Rome to keep his throne. At that time, Rome was becoming the most powerful political force in the Mediterranean world. Its armies were strong, its generals were ambitious, and its influence extended far beyond the borders of Italy. Ptolemy the 12th understood that Roman support could protect his crown. But this protection came at a price. Large amounts of Egypt's wealth were used to maintain political alliances with Roman leaders. Taxes increased. Public frustration grew. For young Cleopatra, these events were not distant political news. They were part of her daily life. She watched as diplomats arrived from Rome. She listened as advisors argued about the future of Egypt. She saw how fragile royal power could be. The palace may have looked magnificent from the outside, but inside it was a place where caution was necessary and trust was rare. Despite these tensions, Cleopatra continued her studies with determination. The Greek historian Plutarch later wrote something remarkable about her. He suggested that Cleopatra's charm did not come only from beauty. It came from her intelligence, her voice, and her ability to communicate ideas clearly. This combination made her presence powerful and memorable. The Roman statesman Cicero once wrote, "The authority of those who teach is often an obstacle to those who want to learn." Cleopatra seemed to avoid this obstacle. She did not simply memorize information. She asked questions. She observed how leaders behaved. She learned from both successes and mistakes. One important decision made her especially unique among her family. Cleopatra chose to learn the Egyptian language. Many rulers of the Ptolemaic dynasty spoke Greek and rarely connected deeply with the local population. Cleopatra broke this tradition. By speaking the language of her people, she built a bridge between the royal palace and the ordinary citizens of Egypt. This decision would later strengthen her reputation as a true Egyptian ruler rather than a distant foreign queen. But the world around her was changing quickly. Rome continued to expand its influence across the Mediterranean. Many independent kingdoms slowly lost their freedom as Roman power grew stronger. The Roman general Pompey once described Rome's ambition with simple confidence. He said, "Stop quoting laws to us. We carry swords." This statement reflected the reality of the era. Military power often decided the fate of nations. Egypt was rich, but it was not strong enough to ignore Rome. Cleopatra understood that survival required more than wealth. It required intelligence, diplomacy, and careful alliances. Yet before she could apply these lessons, her own life would soon change dramatically. When Cleopatra was still a young woman, the stability of her family began to crumble. Political struggles within the royal court grew more intense. Advisors competed for influence. Family members positioned themselves closer to the throne. Then the moment arrived that would transform Cleopatra's future forever. Her father died. According to royal tradition, Cleopatra was meant to share the throne with her younger brother. The arrangement was supposed to maintain stability in the kingdom. But history often shows that shared power creates new conflict instead of peace. Soon, rival groups inside the palace began supporting different rulers. Political advisors whispered in private rooms. Generals calculated their loyalties. The palace that once felt like home slowly became a battlefield of influence and ambition. Cleopatra realized that being born into power did not guarantee safety. It only meant that the struggle had already begun. The philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli would later write words that perfectly describe this reality. He said, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." Cleopatra was still very young, but she was already entering a world where leadership required courage and strategic thinking. Soon the tension inside the palace would erupt into open conflict. Cleopatra would be forced to leave the capital city. Her enemies believed that once she was gone, her story would quietly end. But they did not truly understand the woman they were challenging. Because exile would not destroy Cleopatra. It would only sharpen her determination. Far from the palace, she began gathering loyal supporters and planning her return. And at that exact moment, another powerful drama was unfolding across the Mediterranean world. Rome itself was entering a massive civil war between two legendary leaders. One of them would soon arrive in Egypt. His name was Julius Caesar, and his arrival would change Cleopatra's destiny forever. Chapter 2. The Dangerous Game of Power. When Cleopatra was forced to leave Alexandria, many people believed her story was over. In the ancient world, exile often meant disappearance. A ruler without a palace, an army, or political support usually faded quietly into history. But Cleopatra was not ready to accept defeat. She had spent her entire childhood observing how power worked. She had watched diplomats negotiate, generals argue, and advisors whisper behind closed doors. She understood something very important about leadership. Power rarely disappears. It simply moves to a new place. Now Cleopatra had to rebuild her power from nothing. After leaving Alexandria, she traveled to the eastern borders of Egypt. These regions were far from the royal palace, but still loyal to the Egyptian crown. Here Cleopatra began gathering supporters. Local leaders, soldiers, and political allies slowly joined her cause. Some respected her intelligence. Others believed she represented the rightful future of the kingdom. Every new ally increased her strength, but time was dangerous. Inside Alexandria, the advisors controlling her younger brother were strengthening their own rule. They believed Cleopatra would never return, yet Cleopatra had something they underestimated: patience. The Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu once wrote words that perfectly describe this moment. He said, "In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity." Cleopatra waited for that opportunity. While she was preparing her return, events far beyond Egypt were changing the balance of power in the entire Mediterranean world. Rome, the rising superpower of the age, had fallen into civil war. Two of the greatest Roman leaders were fighting for control of the Republic. One was the famous General Pompey. The other was the ambitious and brilliant commander Julius Caesar. Their conflict divided the Roman world. Armies marched across provinces, cities chose sides. The future of Rome itself hung in uncertainty. The Greek historian Herodotus once wrote, "In peace sons bury their fathers, in war fathers bury their sons." This tragic truth was unfolding across Roman territories as the civil war spread. Eventually, the struggle reached a decisive moment. Caesar defeated Pompey in a major battle. Pompey fled across the Mediterranean searching for safety. His destination was Egypt. Pompey believed Egypt would welcome him. After all, the Egyptian royal family had long relied on Roman alliances. But the advisors ruling Alexandria feared Caesar's growing power. They believed the safest decision was to remove Pompey entirely. When Pompey arrived in Egypt, he was betrayed and killed. His death was meant to impress Caesar. The advisors hoped that eliminating Caesar's enemy would earn his gratitude. But when Caesar arrived in Alexandria and saw the result, he was not pleased. According to historical accounts, Caesar was disturbed by the betrayal. Pompey had once been his ally and even his family member through marriage. The Roman statesman Cicero later wrote something that reflects Caesar's attitude toward such actions. He said, "The greater the power, the more dangerous the abuse." Egypt now faced a complicated situation. Caesar had arrived with Roman authority and military strength. At the same time, Egypt itself was divided between rival rulers. For Cleopatra, this moment was the opportunity she had been waiting for. She understood something that many others did not. The future of her kingdom would now depend on Roman politics. If she could win Caesar's support, she could return to power. But approaching Caesar would not be easy. Her enemies controlled Alexandria. The palace was guarded. The political atmosphere was filled with suspicion. Still, Cleopatra decided to take a risk. The Roman philosopher Seneca once said, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." Cleopatra had prepared her entire life for leadership. Now, opportunity had finally arrived. She secretly arranged a meeting with Caesar. Ancient historians tell a famous story about this meeting. According to the legend, Cleopatra entered the palace hidden inside a large carpet that was carried to Caesar as a gift. When the carpet was opened, she appeared before him unexpectedly. Whether every detail of this story is accurate or not, the message behind it remains powerful. Cleopatra understood the value of dramatic moments. When she met Caesar, she did not appear as a frightened exile. She appeared confident, intelligent, and determined. Caesar quickly realized that Cleopatra was far more capable than the advisors controlling her brother. Their conversation was not only about politics. It was about the future of Egypt and Rome. Caesar respected intelligence. Cleopatra spoke with clarity and confidence. The Roman historian Plutarch later described Cleopatra's presence in an interesting way. He suggested that her greatest strength was not physical beauty alone. It was the power of her personality and the charm of her voice. These qualities made her unforgettable to those who met her. Soon, Caesar decided to support Cleopatra's claim to the throne. This decision shocked the political groups controlling Alexandria. They had expected Caesar to support the existing rulers. Instead, he chose Cleopatra. Tension quickly turned into open conflict. For months, Alexandria became a battlefield. Roman soldiers loyal to Caesar fought against forces supporting Cleopatra's brother. Fires burned in parts of the city. Ships clashed in the harbor. The struggle for Egypt's future had begun. The philosopher Plato once wrote, "The measure of a man is what he does with power." In this moment, Caesar used his power to shape the destiny of Egypt. After intense fighting, Cleopatra's enemies were defeated. Her brother's forces collapsed. Cleopatra returned to the throne of Egypt. The young princess who had been forced into exile was now queen once again. But the story did not end with victory. Something else was developing between Cleopatra and the Roman general who helped restore her power. Their alliance soon grew into a close personal relationship. This relationship would influence the politics of both Egypt and Rome. In time, Cleopatra would give birth to a son. He would be named Caesarion. For Cleopatra, this child represented more than family. He symbolized a possible future alliance between Egypt and Rome. For a brief moment, it seemed that Cleopatra had achieved something remarkable. She had regained her throne. She had formed a powerful alliance with Rome's most famous leader. And she had secured a potential heir connected to both worlds. Yet history rarely remains stable for long. Far away in Rome, political tensions were growing again. Many senators feared the rising influence of Julius Caesar. Conspiracies formed quietly in the shadows of Roman politics. And soon, a single violent day would change everything. Because in the heart of Rome, a group of conspirators was preparing to strike. Their target was the most powerful man in the Roman world, Julius Caesar. His death would once again place Cleopatra in a dangerous and uncertain position. And it would introduce another powerful Roman leader into her life, a general named Mark Antony. Chapter 3. Love, Power, and Empire. The news traveled across the Mediterranean like a dark storm. Julius Caesar was dead. In the city of Rome, a group of senators had surrounded him inside a government building. They believed they were saving the Republic from a man becoming too powerful. With hidden knives, they attacked him together. The Roman world was shocked. For Cleopatra, the news was more than political tragedy. It was a sudden collapse of the alliance that protected her throne. The man who had restored her power was gone. The political balance that kept Egypt safe was now broken. Once again, Cleopatra stood at the edge of uncertainty. The Roman philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote words that describe such moments. He said, "The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it." Cleopatra understood that history was moving again, and she had to move with it. After Caesar's death, the Roman world did not return to peace. Instead, a new struggle for power began almost immediately. Several leaders competed to control Rome. Among them, 3 men formed an alliance that historians later called the Second Triumvirate. These men were Octavian, the adopted son of Caesar; Mark Antony, one of Caesar's most trusted generals; and Lepidus, another powerful Roman leader. Together they promised to restore order to Rome, but beneath the alliance each man also sought his own power. For Cleopatra, the most important of these figures was Mark Antony. Antony was very different from Caesar. Caesar was known for his calm intelligence and strategic thinking. Antony was bold, energetic, and passionate. He was also a brilliant military commander. The Greek philosopher Aristotle once observed, "The energy of the mind is the essence of life." Antony possessed this energy in abundance. In time, he began reorganizing the eastern territories of the Roman world. These lands included regions close to Egypt. Cleopatra understood that another alliance with Rome might be necessary for Egypt's survival. Soon, a message arrived from Antony. He requested that Cleopatra meet him in the city of Tarsus. Many rulers would have approached such a meeting cautiously, but Cleopatra saw an opportunity. She remembered the lesson she had used years earlier when meeting Julius Caesar. First impressions could change the course of history. When Cleopatra traveled to meet Antony, she did not arrive quietly. Ancient historians describe a scene that became one of the most famous in history. Her ship moved slowly along the river. Its sails were purple, and its deck decorated with gold. Perfume filled the air as musicians played soft music. Cleopatra appeared dressed like the goddess Isis, the powerful Egyptian symbol of motherhood and magic. The entire scene was designed to create a powerful impression. When Antony saw this arrival, he was fascinated. But the meeting was not only about beauty and spectacle. Cleopatra was also a skilled political thinker. She spoke about trade, alliances, and the stability of the Eastern Mediterranean. She reminded Antony that Egypt was one of the richest kingdoms in the world. Grain from Egypt helped feed large populations across the region. An alliance with Egypt meant economic strength. Antony quickly realized that Cleopatra was not merely a symbolic queen. She was a capable ruler who understood both politics and strategy. Soon, their relationship became both political and personal. They formed a powerful partnership that would influence events across the Mediterranean. The Roman historian Plutarch later wrote that Antony found Cleopatra impossible to forget. Her intelligence, humor, and presence made every conversation lively and engaging. Their alliance brought stability to Egypt for a time. Antony supported Cleopatra's rule. In return, Egypt provided wealth and resources for Roman campaigns in the east. Together, they began building influence across several territories. To many observers, it seemed that Antony and Cleopatra were creating a new center of power outside Rome. This worried many Roman leaders. Among them was Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar. Octavian was young but extremely ambitious. He believed that Antony's growing alliance with Cleopatra threatened the balance of power in Rome. The Greek historian Thucydides once wrote something that describes political rivalry perfectly. He said, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." Octavian did not intend to be weak. Gradually, tension between Octavian and Antony increased. Political speeches in Rome began attacking Cleopatra. Octavian's supporters described her as a dangerous foreign queen influencing Roman decisions. These stories were partly propaganda, but they were effective. Many Romans began to believe that Antony was becoming loyal to Egypt instead of Rome. The conflict between the two Roman leaders slowly moved toward open war. Meanwhile, Cleopatra continued strengthening her kingdom. She expanded trade routes. She supported economic growth. She worked to maintain stability inside Egypt. Her partnership with Antony also produced children who represented a connection between their two worlds. For Cleopatra, these children symbolized a future where Egypt remained strong and independent. But the political storm in Rome was growing stronger. Octavian was carefully preparing for confrontation. He built alliances inside the Roman Senate. He strengthened his military forces. He also used powerful speeches to shape public opinion. The Roman statesman Cicero once wrote, "The authority of those who speak well can shape the destiny of nations." Octavian understood this power of words. He presented the conflict not as a civil war between Romans. Instead, he described it as a struggle against Cleopatra and foreign influence. This strategy united many Roman citizens behind him. Soon, the conflict could no longer be avoided. Antony and Cleopatra prepared their forces. Octavian gathered the strength of Rome. The Mediterranean world was about to witness one of the most decisive confrontations in ancient history. A battle that would determine the fate of Egypt and the future of Rome itself. This confrontation would take place near the western coast of Greece, at a place that history would forever remember. Actium. Chapter 4. The Final Struggle. The wind over the Mediterranean carried the feeling of an approaching storm. Two powerful forces were moving toward a final confrontation. On one side stood Octavian, determined to become the uncontested leader of Rome. On the other side stood Mark Antony and Cleopatra, united by both ambition and loyalty. The fate of kingdoms now depended on a single conflict. The philosopher Heraclitus once said, "War is the father of all things." In the ancient world, this idea often proved true. Wars did not simply destroy cities, they reshaped entire civilizations. As tensions grew, both sides prepared carefully. Octavian strengthened his navy and gathered experienced commanders. One of his most trusted allies was a skilled admiral named Agrippa. Agrippa understood naval warfare better than most generals of the time. Meanwhile, Antony and Cleopatra assembled their own massive fleet. Their ships were large and heavily armed. They carried soldiers, supplies, and the hopes of an empire that refused to surrender its independence. Cleopatra herself provided enormous financial support for the campaign. Egypt's wealth helped supply the armies and ships that Antony commanded. The Roman historian Livy once wrote, "Fortune favors the brave." Antony believed courage and strength would bring victory. Yet war is rarely decided by courage alone. Strategy, timing, and discipline often shape the final outcome. The decisive moment arrived near the western coast of Greece. The location was a narrow stretch of sea near a place called Actium. Here, the fleets of both sides prepared for battle. The sky was clear, but the air felt heavy with tension. Hundreds of ships waited across the water. Thousands of soldiers stood ready with shields and weapons. Each man knew that the coming battle would decide the future of the Roman world. The Roman philosopher Seneca once said, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." Octavian's forces had spent months preparing carefully. Agrippa's naval strategy focused on speed and maneuverability. Their ships were smaller and easier to control during combat. Antony's fleet, by contrast, relied on large and powerful warships. These ships carried more soldiers and weapons, but moved more slowly across the water. When the battle finally began, the sea quickly filled with chaos. Ships rammed into each other. Arrows flew through the air. The sound of crashing wood and shouting soldiers echoed across the water. Smoke rose from burning vessels. At first, the battle seemed balanced. Both sides fought fiercely, but slowly the advantage began shifting toward Octavian's fleet. Agrippa's strategy allowed his ships to surround and isolate parts of Antony's navy. Smaller Roman vessels attacked from multiple directions. As the hours passed, Antony's position became more difficult. Cleopatra's ships were positioned slightly behind the main battle line. They carried valuable supplies and treasure from Egypt. At a critical moment, Cleopatra made a sudden decision. Her fleet turned and began sailing away from the battlefield. Historians still debate why this happened. Some believe it was a planned retreat to protect Egypt's resources. Others believe Cleopatra feared total destruction if the battle continued. When Antony saw Cleopatra's ships leaving the battlefield, he faced a terrible choice: remain and continue fighting, or follow the queen whose alliance and future were tied to his own. Antony chose to follow Cleopatra. He ordered several ships to break away and pursue her fleet across the sea. This decision effectively ended the battle. Without Antony's leadership, the remaining forces lost coordination. Octavian's navy quickly gained full control of the situation. The Battle of Actium was over. Octavian had won. The Roman historian Plutarch later described this moment as the turning point of the entire conflict. For Octavian, the victory was enormous. He now held the advantage in the struggle for power. For Antony and Cleopatra, the defeat was devastating. They sailed back toward Egypt, hoping to rebuild their strength and prepare for the next stage of the conflict. But the reality was becoming clear. Octavian now controlled most of the Roman world. His armies were stronger, and his political support was growing rapidly. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Cleopatra tried to remain calm despite the worsening situation. Back in Alexandria, she worked to strengthen the city's defenses. She gathered remaining loyal forces and prepared for the possibility of invasion. Antony also attempted to rebuild his army, but many former allies began abandoning his cause. Victory attracts supporters. Defeat often leaves leaders isolated. Meanwhile, Octavian moved carefully but steadily toward Egypt. His goal was clear. He intended to end the power of Antony and Cleopatra once and for all. As Roman forces approached Alexandria, the final chapter of this dramatic story was beginning. Inside the city, tension filled the streets. Soldiers prepared for battle. Citizens watched anxiously as events unfolded around them. Antony attempted one final military resistance, but his forces were no longer strong enough to stop Octavian's advance. Defeat became unavoidable. The Roman philosopher Cicero once wrote, "While there is life, there is hope. Yet even hope has limits when the balance of power has completely shifted." Antony eventually received false news that Cleopatra had died. Overcome with despair, he chose to end his own life. But Cleopatra was still alive. When she learned of Antony's fate, she understood that her own future was now extremely uncertain. Octavian would soon enter Alexandria. If captured, she might be taken to Rome and displayed as a defeated queen in a Roman triumph. For a ruler who had spent her life protecting the independence of Egypt, such humiliation was unthinkable. Cleopatra began considering the final choice that remained in her control. A decision that would turn her into one of the most enduring legends in history. Soon the world would hear the final story of the last queen of Egypt. Chapter 5. The Legend of Cleopatra. The city of Alexandria stood silent under a heavy sky. The long struggle for power had reached its final moment. Roman forces led by Octavian were approaching the gates of the city. Inside the royal palace, Cleopatra sat quietly, thinking about the path that had brought her here. For many years, she had fought to protect the independence of Egypt. She had negotiated with powerful leaders. She had built alliances with two of the most famous men in Roman history. She had used intelligence, courage, and diplomacy to keep her kingdom alive. But now the world around her had changed. The philosopher Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." In these final days, Cleopatra likely examined every decision she had made. She remembered the young princess who studied languages in the palace of Alexandria. She remembered the moment she was forced into exile. She remembered the bold meeting with Julius Caesar that restored her throne. She remembered the years of partnership with Mark Antony. Together, they had believed they could shape a new future for the Eastern Mediterranean world. But history had chosen another path. Octavian's forces were now entering Alexandria. Resistance inside the city collapsed quickly. Many soldiers surrendered rather than continue a hopeless fight. Octavian himself was calm and strategic. He understood the importance of controlling both the city and its legendary queen. If Cleopatra were captured alive, she could be taken to Rome. There she would be displayed during a Roman triumph as a symbol of victory. For Roman leaders, such displays were common. Defeated kings and queens were paraded through the streets while crowds celebrated the power of Rome. But Cleopatra understood what such humiliation would mean. She had ruled Egypt as a queen. She had negotiated with the greatest leaders of her time as an equal. To become a prisoner displayed before cheering crowds would destroy everything she had fought to protect. The Roman philosopher Epictetus once wrote something that seems to echo across this moment. He said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Cleopatra decided that even in defeat she would remain master of her own fate. She retreated to her private mausoleum within the palace complex. This place had been prepared earlier as a royal tomb. Inside were treasures, statues, and symbols of Egyptian royalty. Here, Cleopatra waited as Octavian's soldiers secured the city. Historical accounts describe her final days with a mixture of fact and legend. Octavian wanted Cleopatra alive. He hoped to display her in Rome as proof of his victory over Antony. At first, Cleopatra appeared willing to negotiate. She met with Octavian and spoke calmly about the future of her children and the safety of Egypt. Octavian promised that her children would be treated with care. But Cleopatra was not certain she could trust these promises. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius once said, "Waste no more time arguing what a good person should be. Be one." Cleopatra believed that dignity mattered more than survival. Soon she made the final decision that would shape her legend forever. According to the most famous story, Cleopatra ended her life using the bite of a small poisonous snake known as an asp. The snake was hidden inside a basket of figs brought into her chamber. When the moment arrived, she allowed the snake to bite her. 2 loyal attendants remained beside her during these final moments. Historians still debate the exact details of this event. Some believe poison may have been used instead of a snake. Others believe the story of the asp became popular because it carried strong symbolic meaning in Egyptian culture. The cobra was associated with royal power and divine protection. Whatever the exact method, Cleopatra died in the year 30 before the Common Era. She was only 39 years old. With her death, the long history of the Egyptian pharaohs came to an end. Egypt soon became a province of the Roman Empire. Octavian returned to Rome as the undisputed leader of the Roman world. In time, he would take the title Augustus and become the first Roman emperor. The Roman Republic officially transformed into an empire. Cleopatra's story might have ended there as a simple historical footnote, but something extraordinary happened after her death. Her life began to grow into legend. Writers, poets, and historians across many centuries became fascinated by her story. The Roman historian Plutarch wrote one of the earliest detailed descriptions of Cleopatra's life. His work influenced many later authors. Centuries later, the English writer William Shakespeare created a famous play about Cleopatra and Antony. In this play, Cleopatra appears as a passionate and powerful queen whose love and ambition challenge the forces of empire. Art, literature, and film continued retelling her story in new ways. Sometimes she was portrayed mainly as a great beauty. Sometimes she appeared as a dangerous manipulator of powerful men. But modern historians have begun to understand a deeper and more realistic picture. Cleopatra was not simply a romantic figure from ancient stories. She was a highly educated ruler who understood diplomacy, economics, and international politics. She spoke many languages and connected with both Egyptian and Greek traditions. She used intelligence and strategy to defend her kingdom during one of the most dangerous periods in ancient history. The historian Stacy Schiff once wrote that Cleopatra was one of the most misunderstood women in history. For centuries, Roman propaganda shaped how people remembered her. Octavian's supporters portrayed Cleopatra as a foreign temptress who corrupted Roman leaders. This narrative helped justify Rome's conquest of Egypt. But when historians examine the evidence carefully, they see a different picture. Cleopatra was a capable and determined leader who tried to protect her nation against a rapidly expanding empire. Her alliances with Caesar and Antony were not only romantic relationships, they were also strategic partnerships designed to secure Egypt's survival. In many ways, Cleopatra faced a challenge that leaders throughout history have faced. How do you protect a smaller nation when a powerful empire stands at your borders? The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Cleopatra's why was the independence and prosperity of Egypt. Even when the situation became hopeless, she refused to surrender her dignity. This is why her story continues to fascinate people across the world. She represents courage in the face of overwhelming power. She represents intelligence in a world dominated by military strength. She represents the human desire to control one's destiny even when history moves in another direction. Today, the city of Alexandria still exists along the Mediterranean coast. The Great Library is gone. The ancient palaces have disappeared beneath centuries of change. But the memory of Cleopatra remains alive. Archaeologists continue searching for traces of her tomb and the monuments of her reign. Historians continue studying the political world she navigated with such skill. Her story reminds us that history is not only about empires and battles. It is also about individuals whose decisions shape the course of civilizations. Cleopatra lived during a time when the ancient world was transforming. The age of independent kingdoms was ending. The age of empire was beginning. Her life stands at the crossroads of these two eras. The Roman historian Tacitus once wrote, "The desire for safety stands against every great and noble enterprise." Cleopatra chose the noble enterprise of defending her kingdom rather than quietly accepting the power of Rome. Even though she ultimately lost the struggle, her courage ensured that her name would never disappear from history. More than 2,000 years later, people still speak about Cleopatra, not only as a queen of Egypt, but as a symbol of intelligence, ambition, resilience, and mystery. And perhaps that is the true reason her legend endures, because Cleopatra reminds us that history is not written only by armies and empires. It is also written by individuals bold enough to challenge them. Her life began as the story of a young princess in a palace filled with danger. It ended as the story of a queen whose name would travel across centuries. Between those two moments lies one of the most remarkable stories the ancient world has ever known. The story of Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, and one of the most unforgettable figures in human history.